Art supplies are kind of like food. They're something that each of us is drawn to differently. Some of us love a particular art supply because that's what we grew up with. That's what we used alongside our older siblings, our mother or our father. Perhaps we have exciting memories of the first time that we ran into that particular thing. Likewise, just like when you get to college and you get to try Korean food or Indian food for the first time, sometimes at that point in your life, or maybe when you were older, you ran into something new and enticing. It was exciting, and it wasn't tied to your youth like so many of the other mediums that you've tried. And of course, when I talk about art supplies, I mean the particular medium you use when you're making the art. Not necessarily the thing that you make it on, such as paper, canvas, skin, the side of a boat, though those might need their own episode at some point in time. No, I'm talking about the medium you use for art, and in turn, which of these might work best for you? Well, greetings. My name is Zach, and welcome to podcast episode 75. Today, we are discussing art mediums and which might work best for you. This topic, in part, comes from a community question a little while back, with the focus specifically being on how do you choose the correct materials for the project at hand. I'm extending this a little bit, and I think it might be a little bit more fun, but we'll see how this goes. In this particular episode, I'm going to go over a slew of artistic mediums, list out some of their defining characteristics and features, then go into a breakdown of what kind of artists or personality traits might align well. This might be helpful, it might just be funny, but let's see what happens. Feel free to check out the Discord and Patreon link below as we are getting started. Okay, so let's get this out of the way at the beginning. Everyone can likely learn any of these artistic mediums in a sense of learning how to enjoy them, use them well, and get across what you want to. There can always be circumstances in your life that make it easier for you to enjoy a particular medium that you might not have generally gravitated toward, and yet, I think many of us have mediums that make more sense for how we approach the world. That out of the way, let's have some fun with this, and try not to take it too seriously. All right, our first medium is pencils. Right off the bat, pencils are precise. They're able to be sharpened into a very precise point. This gives you good control. You're able to do many different things with them. They're generally a comfortable medium, being one that we spend a ton of time with here in the West as we're going through school. They're very approachable in that manner. Beyond just being able to be sharpened to whatever sharpness you desire, they come in a variety of tones, colors, and hardnesses, again, giving you tremendous levels of control. And, as a last beneficial feature, they are not particularly expensive, even if you buy them on the high end. So you might like pencils as a medium if you want to get into art quickly. If jumping back into art or getting into it for the first time is something that is exciting and enticing for you, pencils might be just the thing. They are relatable. You probably used them for hundreds, if not thousands of hours during your youth, and as such, it's easier to make those adjustments and to start making art quickly. On the other side, you probably have some lying around the house, and if you didn't, you'd likely be able to purchase some for very cheap. And if you find that you really enjoy drawing with a particular kind of pencil, either drawing pencils that have varying hardnesses and lightnesses, or if you're like me and you like mechanical pencils a lot, they're not very hard to find. They're really accessible. In fact, most grocery stores are going to carry basic pencils. So if you want to get into art quickly, pencils might be good for you. You might also like them if you desire a high level of control in your artwork. So if you look at yourself and how you approach the world and you like control in your hobbies, you like control in your pursuits, pencil can be a really good thing for you. Not only does it allow you to sharpen your lead down to, which isn't lead anymore, of course, it's almost always graphite, but there are a lot of materials that you can use for pencil. But not only can you sharpen that down to exactly the width that you require, there's a lot of control in the way that you hold it. As the pencil loses its sharpness, it does different things better. Many pencils, even of a particular darkness level, can go very dark and very light. Shading is so much easier with a pencil. The biggest thing here is that it is a very diverse tool, and it can give you a lot of control both on the basic end when you're first learning how to manipulate it, but also as you become more proficient. In fact, there are wonderful pencil artists on this platform and on Instagram. I would highly recommend that you check out Steven Zapata. I'll link him down below. He's a wonderful pencil artist and does incredible work. You might also like pencils if you find some comfort in being able to erase. Some of the mediums that we're going to talk about today are going to be erasable, or you're going to be able to layer things on top. And for some artists, this is really beneficial. I actually erase very little of my pencil drawings, so I use pencil as an underlayer on a lot of things, and I do erase those out. I find that if you are stressed or anxious about making particular marks or shading things because you think they're going to be permanent, sometimes having that backup, knowing that you can erase things, that you can change things if you want to, can be really beneficial. So if being able to step backward in an analog sense, you don't have Control Z here on a pencil, but you do have an eraser. That can be a really rewarding and beneficial thing, especially if anxiety or stress kind of rear their heads whenever you work on your artwork. You might like pencil if you're aiming toward realism, or you simply enjoy soft gradients. You will find this if you experiment with a lot of artistic mediums, but there's certain things about them that just feel right. One of the things I really enjoy about pencils, and I get this in a lesser form with ballpoint pens, is that you're able to shade. I can make something go from white to a really dark tone really easily with a pencil. Yes, I have to adjust my grip, and that is a really important thing to do if you're learning how to draw with pencil for the first time. Don't always choke way up on the pencil like you might do if you're writing cursive. It's good to hold it at different lengths. It's good to experiment with different grips. There are other people on this platform that can give you some really lovely pencil tips that will help you in that regard. But if you like realism, those soft shades, the ability to go from one thing to another and create hard edges as well, pencil can be a lovely opportunity for you there. Lastly here, you might like pencils if you are frugal. They are likely the cheapest of the mediums to get into, simply due to the fact that you probably have one lying around the house now. Now, I don't mean frugal in a condemning way. I am very frugal. I don't like spending money that I don't have to spend. And especially if this is a new hobby for you or something that you're toying with getting back into, it lowers the barrier of entry if you can go spend $5 on a couple mechanical pencils and maybe $10 on a sketchbook, and you're back in business. You're starting back into art again. So if you are frugal, if the idea of spending a whole bunch of money to get set up on something is intimidating to you, or you just don't have that opportunity, then perhaps pencil is the right medium for you. Well, next up we have crayons and markers. And yes, I am talking about these in some serious sense. What are the features then? They're nostalgic, used in many places during childhood. In fact, there's a really good chance that the first medium you ever worked with artistically when you were 2 or 3 or 4 years old was crayons, or probably followed by markers. They are accessible and cheap. They're easy to replace, and they're destroyable, which is something we'll come back to in a little bit. There's many colors, and they're considerably high chroma, so if you like really bright colors, crayons and markers are often going to give you that in a really quick, easy, and efficient way. You might like crayons or markers if you want to get back into the roots of your art making. So if you are diving back in as an adult, maybe even as an older teenager, just somebody who hasn't made any art in a long time, it can be really rewarding to jump back in exactly where you left things. And to be honest, crayons and markers get a bad reputation because they're often considered childish, but they can be used in wonderful ways. They might be a good medium choice for you if you want to limit pressure on yourself. Because they are cheap, because they're really easily accessible, and even because they're tied in with youth, there can be a limited degree of pressure. If you're sitting down with oil paints for the first time, which we will get to later, there is some innate pressure there. Those are expensive supplies. If you mess up the first layer that you put down, you're going to be dealing with that for some time. It creates some innate pressure and anxiety concerning the medium. However, if you're working with crayons or markers, this is much more limited. You're likely not going to feel the same level of pressure you are with many other mediums. If you mess up on a drawing with crayons and markers, you can throw that piece of printer paper away and grab another one, and you have wasted only a couple moments and a couple cents. It's just not that big a deal. So crayons and markers can be a really good way to limit the pressure that you accidentally put on yourself. They're a great medium as well if you like to experiment. There are many interesting things you can do with markers and crayons. Because they are cheap, they can often be taken apart, disassembled, or destroyed in the process of making a piece of artwork. I had many cases where students would actually take crayons, glue them to canvases or other materials, and melt them. I think this was often done with a hairdryer even, which again is something you probably have access to. They would melt them and create these really intriguing designs on the canvases. Sometimes it would be, a character holding an umbrella and all of the melted crayon would just kind of bounce off of there. Kind of cool ideas. They can actually just be melted down and reforged into new crayons, essentially, because as they harden again, they're something you can draw with again. Markers, likewise, can be pounded and broken into different various shapes and can create really interesting results when you do that. This is something that might be fun and, again, limited stress because you're experimenting with something that's not particularly expensive. There's not a stigma if you break a couple crayons or if you break a couple markers. Lastly here, you might like crayons and markers if you have a countercultural bend to you. It's easy with something like this, a material that is generally looked down upon or condescended by a more adult art community, and make beautiful things with it as a kind of thumbing your nose at the avant-garde artists. There's some really cool things that you can do here. Imagine getting gigantic pieces of paper or even cardboard and making immense illustrations that when you get up close, you realize, oh, this is made with crayon. There's an interesting, almost punk rock aspect to this, doing things simply because it's different than what everyone else is doing. And so while crayons and markers are often thought of as only being the tools of children, there is no reason why you, at whatever point you're getting back into art, can't choose those as your medium of choice. Next on the list, we have watercolor paint. Watercolor paint is fast drying. It is generally made from some kind of powdered pigment that is pushed into, generally, like a hockey puck. There are watercolors that come in tubes, but for most people, the most accessible ones you're going to run into are going to be these little pucks of pigment that you're going to add water to and you're going to be able to paint with. This medium often works best going from light to dark. It is very hard using traditional watercolor to make white tones go over dark tones. If you use something like gouache, you can escape this, but for now, we're just talking about watercolor. If you want to hear about gouache, just let me know in the comments below and maybe we can hit that next time. Watercolor offers a significant degree of control. This is because watercolor dries fairly quickly. It is going to be done on a generally small scale, so you're going to be using smaller brushes, and it's going to be a really good entry point into painting in general. It's also very accessible and cheap to start in comparison to other paints. You might like watercolor if you want to try out painting and there's some other thing that is prohibiting you from doing so. Now, this could be the cost. It is often quite expensive to get into something like acrylic or oil painting, but to be totally honest with you, the watercolors that I use for most of my artwork is a tiny little stackable tin that I think cost $10, and I bought it a decade ago, and I'm still using it. My watercolor brushes, generally I will use 3 to 5 at any given time. They were all individually purchased for several dollars a piece, but there are very many good watercolor brush sets that are only going to cost you $10 or $15. Now, granted, watercolor does require its own paper. You want thicker paper when you're working on watercolor, but if you buy a watercolor sketchbook or a mixed media sketchbook, it's only going to set you back maybe $10 to $20. So you can get started with watercolor paint, all things included, for probably about $30, which is pretty reasonable. And you could probably do it even cheaper if you went to somewhere like Walmart and just picked up whatever they had on hand there. So it is a good thing to get into if you want to try out painting. So much of learning how to paint at all is just learning how a brush works, learning to build things in layers, and you can practice all of that in watercolor. Watercolor was one of the first mediums that I fell in love with, and it gave me a huge head start when later on I moved into tempera paint, acrylic paint, and oil paint. You might like watercolor if you lack the patience for long drying times. Because with watercolor, you're only basically waiting for the water to soak into the paper and evaporate in tandem, you generally don't have to wait more than just a couple minutes for things to dry. If you're using fast drying acrylic paint, you're still probably going to be looking at 10 to 20 minutes. If you're working with oil paint, you might be looking at several weeks. So if you lack the patience, or whatever kind of schedule you have for art prohibits you from waiting for long periods of time, watercolor might be better in this way. Also, as a beginner, I think watercolor is a better place to start because these faster drying times allow you to try things out in succession much more quickly. It's easier to make a painting, decide you didn't like some part of it, decide that some part of it isn't going to work down the line, and start a new one. Whereas with acrylic or oil, there are different strategies there. So if the drying time of other paints is agitating to you, watercolor might be the right choice. You might enjoy watercolor as well if you really enjoy drawing and you don't want to stray that far. So if you have been really into drawing for the vast majority of your artistic time and you don't want to get away from that, you really enjoy it, watercolor is a nice thing to step into. It technically is a drawing medium, in part because once you have a layer down with something dark, you can't go over it with something lighter, but also because the pigment is actually being left on the paper in the same way that it would be with a colored pencil or with a standard graphite pencil. So I often found in my own education, and then especially when I was teaching, that students moved really quickly from drawing into watercolor. In fact, the two mediums actually interact really well as well. One of the most exciting moments for me artistically was when I was in high school and I started working with ink and watercolor, layering one on top of the other. The nice part about working with India inks or any waterproof ink is once it's dried, you can go back over with watercolor. The nice part is that you can do this back and forth the whole time. So you could start with watercolor, layer ink on top, go back and add more watercolor, add more ink on top, and it just doesn't matter. As long as both layers are dry before you get to the next one, you're generally fine. But it allows a lot of the same precision that you might enjoy if you work with pencils primarily. In fact, it makes a great first foundational layer for doing just about anything. So if you wanted to start a colored pencil drawing, you could actually start with a watercolor painting underneath and then go back over the top. You might enjoy watercolor if you like slow and methodical work. This might sound kind of odd, but I like methodical things. I like putting models together. I like painting, walls, not like artistically painting, but I like doing things that just have a lot of mundane activities that I'm going to need to work on for a long period of time. I know this is probably strange and a lot of people don't, have that same trait, but if you are like me, or you like slow methodical things, the ability to see mistakes popping up long before they do, the ability to see something gradually come together, then watercolor might be a good medium for that personality trait of yours. I really enjoy it because it takes forever to do, but there's some joy in watching things come together over the long term that I just don't get with a lot of other artistic mediums. I also get this in ink drawing, but we'll touch on that a little bit later. Lastly, you might enjoy watercolor paint if you're patient, and this ties right back into what I said. So I'm not going to expand here, but if patience is something you want to develop or patience is something you have in abundance, watercolor might be the medium for you. All right, let's move into the other end of painting with oil paint. Oil paint has great color retention and longevity. There's a reason that so many of the paintings from the olden days, if you want to call it that, are done in oil. Not only was it the medium that they had access to, but it lasts for an extraordinarily long period of time. In fact, if you can keep dust and grime and oils off of oil paint, not more oils, but like the oils from fingers and things like that, you can actually retain the color for years, decades, and even up to hundreds of years, which is a wonderful thing. So if color is really important to you, it might be a good feature. It's very respected in the artistic community. In fact, if you are going to learn how to paint, the goal is almost always to get you to where you're using oil paint. It has a large learning curve, but it's very malleable once understood. There is some pride to be taken in working to learn a skill that takes some time, but it's also advantageous because once you understand how the medium works, there is so much you can do with it. It has very long drying times. For some people, this is a bad feature, but for people who like to blend things, to get really soft skin tones or gradients in your clouds and in your skies, it's going to be a wonderful trait. It also has some significant tie-ins to art history, where some of these other mediums don't because they either weren't used or they degraded over the eons, and so they're not something we can look back at. Well, you might like oil painting if you like a challenge. So it is a little bit harder of a medium to work with, and largely because it's less forgiving. If you get something down on an oil painting and then later discover that you really don't like where it is, depending on the consistency of the paint when it went down, how long it's been drying, you might simply have to wait for the paint to dry in order to fix that mistake. There have been many times where I've been working on an oil painting and I've had to abandon it for several weeks or several months so that things completely dry before I can come back and finish it. On the other side, when you really nail something with an oil painting, it is incredibly satisfying. And I think this comes from the fact that it is a challenge. This kind of painting requires a little bit more planning. Yes, you can be spontaneous, but it seems to be a little bit more rewarding for those who've planned ahead. Acrylic, which we'll get into after this, is going to be a little bit better, I think, if you tend to be more spontaneous. So if you're looking for a challenge, you take pride in learned skill, you really want to reach high and try something that is traditional in that way, oil painting might be a good medium for you. It also might be a good medium for you if color is very, very important to you. Like I mentioned earlier, oil paint tends to hold its color for a long time. The biggest aspect of this, though, is that most mediums change color as the medium dries. If you've ever had some frustration with putting down some pen strokes, some brush strokes with acrylic, even letting your watercolor paint dry and then it dries and it looks different than it did earlier. Maybe you put a spray fixative over the top so that your pastel drawing can't blur or blend or get smudged, and now it looks a little bit darker because of course it does. You might take some solace in working with oil paint. Because oil paint takes so long to dry, the colors very, very seldom change. And so you end up with these wonderfully bright yellows and whites and reds, even in the finished product. So if you find that color is a very important part of art for you, you use it to symbolize particular feelings and emotions, or you just really want to capture that moment, then that aspect of oil paint might be enough to push through some of the other difficulties. Oil paint might be a great medium for you if you've already been painting. So if you are not new to painting, you've done a lot of time with watercolor or you put a lot of time into acrylic and you're looking to step things up, oil paint can be a great option. I don't mention this here as a joke. As artists, we often try to avoid things that seem intimidating or scary to us. I could not tell you how many times when I first introduced oil paint to my students that even the top-end students shied away from it. They were scared. They had built up a reputation in their head for what it was like, how unforgiving it was, and so they were scared to try it. Now, for most of them with some mild experience in paint prior, it wasn't all that scary once they got in. Because if you know how a brush functions, if you know how to mix your colors, if you know how to compose an image, you're really just learning the different facets of oil paint. And to be fair, it is a wonderful medium. It allows for broad, vibrant strokes of color. Because it has so much body to it, a lot of your brush strokes will stay in place if you want them to have that kind of impasto effect that we see in Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. You can do that with acrylic, but it doesn't necessarily hold its body in the same way. If you want to blend things and get things to go from one tone to another beautifully, then oil paint can be a really wonderful medium for you. But it's probably going to be this in a higher percentage if you have spent some time painting before. Lastly, you might enjoy oil paint. It might be the medium for you if you like doing things with an air of sophistication or you're really fond of art history. When you take an art history class and you look back at paintings by Monet, paintings by Degas, paintings by Velázquez, even going back to some of the stuff in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, you are looking at oil paintings. So if you've got some ties to the history, if you really enjoy those things, if you find that fascinating, that alone might be a big enough reason for you to get into it. Likewise, if you're one of those people who likes doing something that is a little bit highbrow, you feel good about yourself or excited working with something that is expensive, something that is sophisticated, oil painting has those qualities. Generally speaking, if you go to an art gallery, you are predominantly looking at oil paintings when you're looking at paintings. When you go to museums, most of the paintings in there are going to be oil paintings. When you look at the paintings that sell for the highest amounts, generally, you're looking at oil paintings. So if that's a thing for you, oil paint might be an awesome media for you to dive into. Well, following up right after that, we have to touch on acrylic paint. Acrylic paint has faster drying times than oil paint. In a lot of ways, it's simply a modern adaptation of oil paint. I don't know that it was made to replace it, but it is a cheaper version. It dries faster, it's more malleable, it's more accessible, and generally, it's a liquid form of plastic. The colors are good in high-end paints, but they're not as good as oil paint, and you'll often see some degradation in them over time, particularly in the drying stages. Basically, they're a cheaper, more modern version of oil, but cheaper is a good thing in that it allows for more progress and less risk. If you mess up a painting in this medium, it's less of a hit to your wallet than it is with oil paint. Acrylic paint is also far more forgiving than oil paint. If you make a mistake in acrylic because it dries so much faster, you're able to go back over inside of maybe an hour. That kind of thing with oil paint, either you're going to have to vary the consistency of your paint, you're using an artificial medium to make it dry faster, or you're simply going to have to wait until the medium itself dries. Layering is a key component of acrylic paint, but it's really easy to learn how to do so. All right, you might like acrylic painting if oil painting scares you. So I know this might sound a little bit funny, but it is true. And like I mentioned with some of my students earlier, it was something I ran into frequently. But there are some really legitimate concerns here. Traditional oil paintings use solvents in order to break down the paint. This is generally mineral spirits, but you can use other paint thinners as well. These chemicals naturally evaporate whenever they're open, so if you are in a confined space, you are going to be inhaling fumes. This is generally not a big deal if you have a well-ventilated space, but I had several classes in college, one in particular I'm thinking about, where we had three 50-gallon drums of mineral spirits. And on the days where we had to keep the doors closed because it was Colorado winter, there were times where you inhaled enough that you felt sick. It's not a good thing. You can mitigate this in some modern oil paints because there are different solvents. There are even water-based oil paints now. But if that whole thing just seems agitating to you or you don't want to deal with it, almost all acrylics, to my mind, break down in water, so you don't have to have any fancy solvents. In addition, acrylic paint damages your clothing a little bit differently than oil paint will. Now, it still needs to come off clothing pretty quickly because it's a plastic, and if it bonds with the fibers of the clothing, that gets a little bit messy, but isopropyl alcohol will sometimes break that down even when it's totally dried. On the other hand, oil paint will actually dye the fabric itself, and so there's not a whole lot you can do about that. If you get oil paint onto a white shirt, that white shirt is toast. At least it's going to have a stain of whatever color that was, and I don't know that there's much of a chance to get that out of there, or at least a much lesser chance. If you get acrylic paint on something, if you get to it fast with warm water and soap, often your clothing will be okay. And lastly here, the drying times. If you don't want to potentially have to wait days or weeks for your painting to dry, either so you can ship it, so you can touch it, so you can hang it, or even just so you can work on the next layer, then acrylic paint might be a better option for you. Acrylic paint might be an option for you though if you enjoy painting and you like working in layers. So like I mentioned with oil painting, where if you've done some painting in the past, you really enjoy painting, acrylic paint is just a no-brainer. Get into it, try it out. It's not nearly as expensive as oil painting, and if you like working in layers like watercolor might have done for you, acrylic's going to do the same thing. You can water down acrylic paint and you can glaze it, where you actually have a layer of paint that is partially translucent. In fact, this will happen with yellows and whites regardless, because the pigmentation in those is hard to get all the way solid and all the way opaque. But if you water down any acrylic paint, you can actually paint these thin glazing layers. Now, of course, you can do this with the other paints as well, but I find it particularly rewarding when it comes to acrylic paint because it dries quickly, you get good color, and you can do lights on top of darks. Acrylic paint might be the medium for you if you enjoy painting on the go. So if you like traveling and taking your paints, I will often do this with watercolor, but if you are just traveling in your car, going on a road trip, acrylic can be wonderful. Part of the reason here is you can finish a painting and inside of an hour or so, it's going to be dry, so you don't have to worry about packing it and making sure that it doesn't touch other things. The couple times where I've taken oil paints on the go and I painted something, I had this weird moment of, okay, now what? I've got a canvas covered in oil paint that won't be dry for weeks, and if anything touches it, not only the painting will be destroyed, but the thing that touched it will likely be destroyed as well. Yes, they make, carrying cases and apparatuses to take care of that, but that's not something that the general everyday artist is necessarily going to have access to. Plein air painting, going out into the wilderness and painting just what is there while you're there in person, is a wonderful thing to do with acrylic paint, even though it's something that is more traditionally done with oils. So it's a great medium to take on the go, and you can often get tiny little containers of it, carry them on a plane with you, and paint wherever you're going. The last thing here is acrylic might be a good medium for you if you like to paint on nearly any surface. Acrylic paint will bond with most things since it's basically a liquid plastic. I had a lot of students who would paint things on walls, on phone cases, on laptop cases, on plastic, on metal, on cardboard, on canvas, on fabric. It will adhere to most anything. Now, obviously, there are other paints that will do this, but watercolor won't do this, and oil paint won't do this. And oil paint won't dry enough that even if it does work in particular cases, it's not going to work the way that you want to. In fact, if you paint with oil paint on top of cardboard, it will just soak and leach in and get gross. It'll look like the bottom of a pizza box. But I actually, when I was really poor and still learning how to paint and going through the early years of my art education, I couldn't afford canvases or paper. So I would just get boxes and I did my acrylic painting practice on those. So there is something to that, in that acrylic paint will stick to most surfaces. And if you like working in strange ways like that, acrylic paint might be the ideal medium for you. All right, next we have pens and fine liners. So these offer extreme precision, even more so than the pencil because they don't dull over time, at least not in the same way. You can get tiny, tiny little marks in exactly the way that you want. You'll notice this is exactly what's happening in the background of this podcast, actually. They're archival and light fast generally, which means they don't break down from UV rays, and they're going to stand the test of time. They give you a stark contrast. Though colored varieties do exist, most of the work in this arena is generally done in black and white, which gives you this wonderful contrast. And they're reliable. Generally, if they're not damaged, each mark will be the same width and same tone every time you make it. So you might like drawing with pens and fine liners if you have an engineering mind. So if you enjoy hard, rigid structures and the precision that comes with them, these might be a great medium for you. They're dependable. If you want to pick up your pen every single time and know it's going to make the same mark, the same width, the same darkness, it's reliable, you can plan, you can give yourself notes, it's going to be really beneficial for you. This is a medium that tailors itself towards messy drawing, towards precise drawing, toward drawing for anime, cartoons, manga, things like that, but also for detailed architectural designs. It has a lot of things that it does a really, really good job at, and it's obviously one of my favorite mediums. I think it is this part of me that has the engineering brain that likes things being precise, it likes knowing what I can count on, and I like that stark contrast. You might enjoy pens and fine liners if you do not fear mistakes or you welcome them. So if you are in a place in your artistic journey where you are trying to beat the perfectionism out of yourself in a, not violent way, these can be a great medium to do that. Likewise, if you just don't struggle with that at all, it can be a really good medium as well. Because each mark you put down is basically there forever, you have to learn how to work around things. I've made a lot of mistakes on my pen and ink drawings, and I don't stress about it anymore because I've learned over time to turn those into something else. And yes, there are ways to work over it. I keep white acrylic or white gel pens on hand, so if I really need to fix something, I can. This drawing probably has one or two of those things. There's no shame in that if you have to change something. But in general, it's a pretty unforgiving medium. And if that's got some benefits to you, like it does me, then this might be a really good medium for you to jump into. Again, if you like slow and methodical work, this might be a good medium for you as well. Just like I mentioned with watercolor, if you like getting your sketch done, the initial lines, and you're going to be content sitting there for an hour or two just making tiny little hatch marks or shading something, this is a lovable medium for you. It's one of the things that I really appreciate about it, because once I've done the work, I just have to get into the flow. I'll put on a podcast or put on Lord of the Rings and just go and make all my tiny little marks for hours. It's a really relaxing way for me to draw. Lastly, this might be the medium for you if you enjoy strong levels of contrast and multiple solutions to the same problem. So learning all the pen techniques, the hatching techniques, how to approximate shading can give you a lot of tools in your toolbox to solve different problems. If you really enjoy Japanese manga or old school American comics, if you like that aesthetic, this is a really good thing to pursue. There's just nothing like it. A pencil drawing will never compete with this level of contrast. Sometimes having limited options can actually make the final result much, much better. And this is a wonderful example of that. Next, we have digital painting and drawing. So some of the features here is the fact that it's a modern and continually advancing medium. It is not all that uncommon every 3 to 6 months for some new feature to come out, some new program to come out. This often requires specialized software and materials, such as a drawing tablet, or an iPad, or a compensatory tablet of some kind. There is access to many, many options and tools. There are so many different brushes that you can use. You can select things, you can build things in layers. There is the ability to redo, to undo, to save progress, to go back to an earlier form of the piece. And there's also an ease of storage and shipping content here. It's much easier to send a digital copy of a file than it is to send a painting across the country or world. So you might like digital drawing and painting if the ability to try out many different things excites you. So not just the ability to try out different programs or brushes, but the ability to literally copy a layer and try a different color scheme. I've done this many, many times where I get to a crossroads in a digital piece. I'm not sure what I want to do, how I want to shade something, how I want to color something. And I can literally take that layer, that portion of the drawing or painting, copy it, paste a copy, and go work on that for a while. If it ends up being what I want, I just delete the other copy and keep moving forward. If I don't like it, or I only like aspects of it, I can remove via the lasso tool individual elements or the whole thing. So there's a lot of forgiveness in that. But if we go back to the programs and brushes for a moment, there are so many different drawing programs and painting programs. If you've only heard of a little bit of digital art, you've probably only really heard of Photoshop, maybe Illustrator. But the reality is, Adobe products are pretty expensive, and Adobe Photoshop is not the best program for digital drawing and painting. It is the most ubiquitous one, and it is probably the one that has the most third-party additional pieces that are built for it. And if you're working in the industry, you're certainly going to need to know how to work with it. But there are a lot of other options. Corel Painter is a wonderful alternative that actually has some of the most realistic brush strokes in a digital medium. Procreate for the iPad is ridiculous. It is so good and so well put together. Krita is a free option and is actually really good. The brush engine in there, I think, works better than Photoshop. And Clip Studio Paint offers another option as well. This is just some. There are probably dozens more that I haven't used personally. I've only mentioned the ones that I've used personally here. On my computer at this moment, I have Krita and I have Clip Studio Paint, and on my iPad I have Procreate. I am no longer using the Adobe products for a whole bunch of reasons, although I've spent 20-25 years using them, so I'm pretty well versed in them as well. But these programs also have access to tons of different options, hundreds of tools, and hundreds to thousands of different brushes that you can use for whatever it is in particular that you want to execute. So if you like options, digital art might be a wonderful choice for you. It also might be a great choice for you if making mistakes scares you or missing opportunities. So when I mentioned the undo feature earlier, it is a huge part of digital art. I know it is kind of a meme and a joke in the art community, but I'm not going to push that agenda forward. I just don't agree with it. If you are the kind of person who has tremendous levels of anxiety or stress because you're afraid of making a mistake in your artwork, this can be a good way to supplant that. I have to say, though, as an art teacher, I would encourage you, don't try to make the perfect mark or the perfect piece. If you're spending 50 hours on a piece that could have been done in 10 if you didn't try to make everything perfect, you're wasting the opportunity to learn more, and you should just keep moving forward. That said, though, I use the undo feature frequently because mistakes happen. I'm not trying to get the perfect line necessarily, but if I make a line in a place where it doesn't belong, in the digital equivalent of dropping my paintbrush and having it make a nice big red mark over the blue area of the background, you can just undo something like that in a digital format. So if the mistakes and the anxiety keep you from art making, then digital can be a wonderful resource for you. Likewise, if you get some joy out of being countercultural, this might be a good medium for you as well. Digital art still gets a lot of crap from the broader artistic community. A lot of people don't understand how much work and effort it takes to make good art digitally. And if you kind of enjoy poking that bear, this might be a good medium for you. This seems silly, perhaps, but I played in punk rock and ska bands in high school, and there was a lot of the things that we did, like skateboarding and the kind of art and music that we were a part of, that we did particularly because it was kind of thumbing our noses at the rest of the population. Or at least we thought it was, right? And that aspect can actually be invigorating for some people. If you feel like working on a digital format and having to defend yourself gives you something that is invigorating and it's exciting about the process, this might be a good medium for you. If technology makes your life better, you love being invested in new things, you love trying out new things, it might be a good medium for you there as well. Part of the reason I got back into digital art when I first did, which would have been like 95 or 96, was because it was exciting and new. My dad brought me home one of the first drawing tablets they had commercially available, and it was so crazy and exciting to be able to work on that. To draw on a computer just felt so strange. If those kind of things are exciting for you, then this might be a good medium for you. And lastly, if you just like having access to everything at your disposal, you like having access to all of the other software, being able to take a file from one location into another, have access to your reference photos. If you want everything artistically in the smallest package possible, there's just no getting around the fact that digital art is the best at that. It gives you access to pieces of drawing, pieces of sculpture, pieces of painting, to photographic elements, to take them into your work, to modify things after you've put them down. I can't take the saturation levels down on a painting after I've made it, but digitally I can. So if you want the highest quantity of options, you want the most bang for your buck, I think digital art is just going to win that battle every day of the week. It is the absolute hands down best at that particular arena. In addition, it's also really travel friendly. So if you want to take something that is super powerful and allows you to work on your art when you're traveling, there's just no getting around digital art as the best medium in that capacity. Okay, that's all I'm going to touch upon today. Obviously, there are so many more artistic mediums that if I try to do them all, we'll be here forever. But if there's any that I missed that you specifically want to hear about in another episode like this, or if you enjoyed this at all, please let me know in the comments below. This is a little bit different of a podcast, but I hope it's been beneficial to those of you who are still listening. And thank you to my patrons as well who are on the screen now. They help make this happen and keep me afloat, which is a really lovely thing. Well, have a good one, y'all. See you soon.